Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. In 1985, a group of officers approaches Farmer Patrick and informs him of a family tragedy. Patrick's brother, sister-in-law, and younger niece have all died. The only survivor is his older niece Jane, who was discovered in a corner of the house covered in blood and holding a shaver. Jane, now 25, is a photographer who specializes in abandoned houses. She was adopted by a foster home after the tragedy, but she had no memory of her childhood, family, or what happened that terrible day. She's now married to Alan, and they have a daughter named Alice, though Jane's relationship with them is strained due to memory lapses that cause her to miss meetings or pick Alice up from school. Jane comes across her childhood home one afternoon while looking for new houses to photograph with Alice. She doesn't recognize it, but she is captivated by it and takes numerous photographs of it. While her mother is at work, Alice discovers a jack on the ground and converses with its enigmatic owner, who cannot be seen. Jane later calls the county chiefs and requests the property records for this farmhouse. It's late at night when someone rings the doorbell, and Jane discovers a box at the door, inside which is the jack Alice discovered and a bug that surprises her. Jane is still obsessed with the latest farmhouse she's seen a few days later, and she can't stop staring at the photo she took after printing it. This causes her to forget about picking up Alice from school until Alan calls to remind her, prompting Jane to rush down the road. While driving, she receives a call from a young girl's voice, whom she misidentifies as Alice, telling her that she wants you to come back. At that moment, a blonde girl appears in the middle of the street, and Jane accidentally crashes her car due to another memory lapse. The last thing she hears before collapsing is "she wants you to come back." Jane awakens in the hospital sometime later, but she has no memory of Alan or Alice. The doctor summons Alan to his office to explain the situation. The accident has aggravated a severe older injury, worsening her amnesia. Meanwhile, Jane is approached by Liam, a psychiatrist who will assist her in working on her memory problem through various exercises. She can regain her memory, but it will take time. Jane hears a noise outside her room and follows it to find Susie, the blonde girl she saw on the road. Several hours later, she attempts to contact the girl, but Susie flees and hides. And Jane is interrupted by Alan and Alice, who are departing for the evening. At least this time, Jane is recognizing their faces. Jane goes to bed after some tests with Liam and looks through a bunch of family photos to try to help her memory. A knock on the door causes her to get up, only to discover a box similar to the one she discovered at home. But this time she discovers a little ballerina inside, along with a picture of the ballerina. Someone had written the date of the tragedy on the other side of the photograph, which caused Jane to have a nervous breakdown. Meanwhile, at home, Alan hears the doorbell ring and discovers an envelope containing important paperwork outside. The next day, Alan brings those papers to Jane with some exciting news. The farmhouse is hers, and her uncle Patrick has been looking after it all along. Jane has no recollection of requesting this paperwork or having an uncle, but she sees this as an opportunity, and Liam agrees that a visit may help her push those old memories out. Jane, determined to learn more about her past, calls Patrick, who is surprised to hear from Jane but promises to welcome her anytime she wants to visit. A few days later, the entire family goes to see Patrick, and Jane makes a point of ignoring her visions of Susie appearing on the road. Patrick apologizes to Jane for placing her in foster care, but he knew he wouldn't be a good father and wanted her to have a good life. Jane asks what happened to her family after he gives her the key to the farmhouse, and Patrick says they died inside the house without going into further detail. Jane is grateful for his assistance, but she cannot recall him. Jane is extremely nervous as the family proceeds to the farmhouse. She exits the building through the back door to get some fresh air, only to hear a strange noise and follow it to the middle of the field, where she finds a red balloon holding a key and a small note welcoming her home. Meanwhile, Alan and Alice investigate the house and discover Jane's childhood room. Alan must find the hidden key to unlock another room belonging to Jane's sister. Inside, they discover an old music box that Alice is unable to open, as well as a few other toys. On their way out, Alan forgets the key inside, and the door locks itself. The following day, the family visits the nearby town. Jane goes to an antique store, where clerk Jennifer guides her subtly to a framed newspaper page from 1985 with an article about the tragedy that implies Jane could be to blame. Jane receives a call from Liam at that moment, as they were supposed to have an appointment today. Liam is pleased to hear she's working on her memories, but he also insists he's at his office, which contradicts Jane's observation that he's now in the store. After they hang up, Jane follows Liam out of the building and into the hay bale maze, where she becomes disoriented and anxious. Finally, she gives up and exits the maze by breaking through one of its walls. Jane then dashes back to her car, where she discovers another small box waiting for her. She tries to ignore it at first, but curiosity gets the better of her and she opens it anyway. Jane discovers half a picture of her younger self, who turns out to be her sister, inside the box. Later at home, Alice interrupts Jane's sleep by asking her to be quiet because they'll hear her. Confused, Jane follows Alice into Susie's room, where she recalls her mother giving her sister the music box. Suddenly, her daughter says Alice isn't really there anymore, and the ghosts of her mother and Susie turn towards Jane, who notices Susie has a tool in her hands. Scared, Jane flees to her old room, where she encounters her younger self and discovers a shaver in her hands that appeared out of nowhere. Desperate and terrified, Jane returns to the main room to try to wake Alan up, but he remains sound asleep while Susie crawls out from under the bed, claiming Jane has come to find them. Jane flees to the closet, but Susie follows her. Susie ends up on the floor with Jane's hands on her, and the moment Jane blinks, she finds herself in Alice's room, her arms wrapped around her daughter. Thankfully, Alice wakes up and shakes her mother out of her trance before returning her to her own room, where Jane no longer sees Susie but discovers a jack on the floor. Jane goes to see Patrick the next day to demand answers. Patrick explains that his brother was a drunk with a bad temper, but he worked hard and never hurt his family, and that Jane is the only one who knows what happened on the day of the tragedy. Later, during breakfast, Alice notices Jane is tired and apologizes for keeping her awake last night, but before Jane can ask her what she means, Alan comes over and Jane asks him to take her to the lake. She believes the house is making her feel worse, so she wishes to return home after Alice receives her wish. Jane enters Susie's room after Alan and Alice have left, using the key that came with the balloon to open it. After a while of looking around, she notices Susie entering the old barn through the window and decides to follow her. Jane discovers their old sheet fort in the old barn, which contains a box containing various objects such as Susie's asthma medicine, a Swiss knife, and a small key that Jane takes with her. Susie appears out of nowhere and tells Jane she shouldn't be there, that she should be hiding because the monster is approaching. Susie then leads Jane inside the fort and instructs her to run until she moves the sheets aside and finds herself in the middle of the field. There's an open box on the ground with an old shaver inside. Meanwhile, Alice tells Alan about some strange dreams she's been having. Alice doesn't believe an old lady who says Jane might hurt her because she knows the real danger is the monster in the bedroom. A few hours later, the family begins packing, unaware that Liam is watching from a distance. Jane can't take her eyes off the old picture until she hears Alice running toward the old barn. When Jane follows her there, she discovers that it is Susie who tells her that they cannot let her leave. Jane is so anxious and scared that she unconsciously wraps her arms around Alice when she appears behind her. While Alice runs back to the house, Alan begins yelling at Jane for hurting their daughter as they follow her out. To their surprise, they discover the barn's Swiss knife stuck in one of the car's flat tires. Jane swears she didn't do it, and their argument is cut short when Alice starts yelling inside the house for help. When her parents arrive, she explains that she had been chased by a man she refers to as the monster under the bed, and that she is now suffering from asthma. This is the first time it has happened, but Jane recognizes it because Susie experienced the same thing. Alan grabs Alice and rushes downstairs, only to discover that the front door is locked. Jane recalls Susie's words and takes a step back, instantly opening the door because the ghosts only want her to stay. While Alan asks a passing car for assistance in getting Alice to the hospital, Jane searches the house for answers and discovers a small piece of paper with the words tag. "You are it." When Jane agrees to play, Susie appears and leads her to her room, where she opens the music box with the barn key inside. She discovers two ballerinas similar to the one she received in the box, as well as the other half of the picture, which reveals Liam is Jane's father. Susie makes Jane hide with her under the bed because the monster is approaching, and at that moment, Patrick enters the room, carrying gifts for Susie inside those same small boxes. Jane flees the bedroom, terrified of what will happen next, but Liam appears and forces her to stay so she can finally understand. Patrick, it turns out, is the monster. Whenever he babysat the girls, he would sneak into Susie's room and take advantage of her. Jane had been hiding under Susie's bed on the night of the tragedy and had to witness everything. When their parents arrived home earlier than expected, Liam promptly fell asleep on the couch. Susie's mother, who turned out to be Jennifer, heard her daughter's pleas for assistance and went upstairs with a tool in hand. When Patrick saw her, he fought her for the tool and killed her, leaving her on the floor for Jane to see. The terrible situation triggered one of Susie's asthma attacks, but instead of assisting her, Patrick pursued young Jane, who had had enough and was attempting to flee. While the noises finally woke Liam up, young Jane crept into the bathroom and grabbed the shaver, which she used to hurt Patrick with before fleeing. Jane collided with Liam on her way downstairs, causing them both to fall and hit the floor. The violent landing killed Liam instantly and injured Jane's head, explaining the amnesia. Patrick went to check on Susie after seeing his brother dead, but it was too late for her as well. The asthma attack killed her. Patrick grabbed the tool and placed it in Liam's hand before leaving to avoid getting into trouble. Jane awoke soon after, and the shock of seeing her dead father scared her so much that she ran to hide in the corner, where the cops later found her. Back in the present, Liam explains that he didn't tell Jane because he needed her to be present to set the ghost free. Jane, in tears, apologizes to her family, who vanish when Alan returns. He explains that Alice is better and that he left her with Patrick, which causes Jane to be concerned about her daughter's safety and forces the car to move with the flat tire. Meanwhile, Patrick begins to speak inappropriately to Alice, promising that she will not tell anyone about the game he will show her and accidentally calling her Susie. When he hears Alan and Jane arrive, he grabs a gun and leads Alice to the barn. Shooting when Alan approaches, because Patrick's attention is focused on Alan, Jane is able to approach him from behind and knock him out with a shovel. Moments later, Patrick awakens in Susie's room with his hands tied, and Jane abandons him there with the door locked, allowing the ghosts to exact their vengeance. Jane has no qualms about visiting her family's grave, where she leaves the old picture to close this chapter of her life and begin a new one with Alan and Alice. Meanwhile, nobody in the old farmhouse can hear Patrick's cries for help. I hope you enjoy the video and remember to subscribe to my channel.